Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forestry Climate Change Working Group workshop for forestry practitioners. It's a pleasure for Till Hill to be hosting this workshop today, entitled The Importance of Carbon in a Climate Emergency. My name is David Edwards, and I am Till Hill's Regional Manager for Wales and Marches, and soon to be Director of Forestry. I've spent many years in the forest industry, and I'm a former president of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. Till Hill is a forestry, timber harvesting and landscaping company first established nearly 75 years ago. We are a member of this working group, created to drive forward closer relationships with government in terms of policy, forestry strategy, regulation, science and innovation. The Forestry Climate Change Working Group, or FCCWG, is a cross-sector body that represents the collective view of the forestry sector on climate adaptation and promotes measures which enhance the adaptation of trees, woods and forests to environmental threats. Members include private, public and voluntary organisations with forestry interests. The group is comprised of several leading forestry organisations, some of which will be joining us today. As a result of the UK's commitment to becoming a net zero economy by 2050, carbon sequestration is likely to become a significant additional source of income for landowners looking to enhance their property with woodland creation, and this can underpin the financial viability of a project. Today's workshop will feature 4 experts in woodland generated carbon and will include a final panel discussion with a Q&A session. So please do drop any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we will discuss at the end of all the presentations. Today we'll be joined by speakers from the Forestry Commission, Woodland Trust, the Woodland Carbon Code and Till Hill's new carbon related business, Carbon Store, to find out how you can join the journey to net zero and play a part in supporting the drive for woodland creation across the UK. Firstly, we have Andy Baker, who works for Scottish Forestry as Woodland Carbon Markets Advisor for the Woodland Carbon Code. Andy received his BSc Hons in Ecology and Environmental Science from the University of Edinburgh in 2013. He is a professional member of the Institute of Chartered Foresters and a technical member of the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Andy will be presenting the Woodland Carbon Code Explained. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks a lot for that, David. I hope you can all hear me and see me. Just share my screen now. So I hope that's all coming through okay. So thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. As David said, I'll be covering the Woodland Carbon Code and just giving you an outline of what it is, what its purpose is, and how it works really. But I know a lot of you will know a lot about that already. So I will just break it down, shouldn't take more than 10 minutes or so, presentation-wise. So to begin with, just what is the Woodland Carbon Code, as I mentioned before, eligibility for land and for planting, etc., and for inclusion within the code. Next, looking at the different obligations that are there for landowners. Looking at the summary of processes and costs, and this will be just a summary because it can change quite a lot depending on where you are and the type of scheme you're planting. And then an interesting part, looking at the monetization of your carbon units and the different routes you can go down to monetize your sequestered carbon. And then just a bit at the end, just looking at where you can find some further information, because even if I focused entirely on this topic for an hour, there's no way we'd cover all of the things about the Carbon Code, as I'm sure many of you know. So first of all, what is the Carbon Code? Well, essentially, it's a UK government-backed standard for woodland carbon projects. And the reason for this is it helps companies to become both carbon neutral or carbon negative, whilst also helping the UK to meet their national carbon reduction targets. The most important of these is the national target to become, or legally binding target, to become carbon neutral by 2050. It's a standard that is based on incredibly high standards, on robust science developed by Forest Research, It's got a transparent registry in the IHS market registry, where you can see exactly where the different carbon units are going, who they're assigned to, whether they've been retired or not. It is independently validated and verified by both the Soil Association and organic farmers and growers. And essentially it allows for the generation of carbon units. So 1 ton of sequestered carbon equivalent is the unit that is generated, and the equivalent refers to other global warming gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. There are 2 types of these units: pending issuance units and woodland carbon units, so PIUs and WCUs. So to give you an example, if you had a project that was predicted to sequester 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent over 100 years, once you planted the scheme and had it validated in year 1, you would generate 1,000 pending issuance units. So those will be assigned to your account. You can then do with what you will. You can sell some of them, all of them, none of them. And then over time, in year 5 and then every subsequent 10 years as a minimum, as your scheme is being verified by the Soil Association or organic farmers and growers, a proportion of those 1,000 PIUs will be becoming converted into 1,000 WCUs. And so year 1, you'll have 1,000 PIUs and no WCUs. By year 100, if all goes well, you should have 1,000 WCUs and no more PIUs. So I hope that makes sense. So the scheme itself is governed by Scottish Forestry, and as I mentioned before, it's backed by research from Forest Research. It's also supported by NRW and the Welsh Government, Forestry Commission in England, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland. I won't touch on this too much, but there's also the Peatland Carbon Code, which has recently reached a very similar status to the Woodland Carbon Code internationally, and allows for the generation of peatland carbon units, so PCUs, just to confuse things further. But as I say, I won't go into that, but if you have time, I'd definitely recommend looking into that side of things as well. So next of all, looking at the eligibility of the different schemes that can generate carbon units through the Woodland Carbon Code. So crucially importantly, at the moment, it's only for new woodland creation. Improvements to management of existing woodlands or changes in management regimes, it doesn't allow for any generation of any more carbon units right now. It may in the future, but for now, only for new woodland creation. Secondly, there's no minimum or maximum area at all for inclusion within the code. It can include natural regeneration. It is a slightly different process and in some ways slightly more complicated, but it is accommodated for. Hedgerows aren't currently included within the code, and I know that's a shame because in some areas we're looking at kilometres worth of hedges that certainly will be sequestering carbon, and it is a future development, but just right now they're not included, and it must be additional. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this for long because it's a very big topic, but essentially additionality asks the question, would the woodland have been planted regardless of carbon finance or the sale of your carbon units? If the answer is yes, we were going to plant it anyway, then it won't be additional. And additionality is a fundamental principle of all international carbon offsetting schemes. You know, we didn't set the rules. So they are the main criteria needed for eligibility under the Woodland Carbon Code. So next of all, to touch on the different obligations for landowner, which is often the question that all of you will receive when you speak into different landowners potentially interested in becoming involved in the carbon code. So first and foremost, in my opinion, most importantly, you must replant in case of catastrophe. And so if you had a fire in year 50 and you weren't under the carbon code, your woodland scheme wasn't under the carbon code, then, and your entire woodland burnt down in year 50, then you couldn't just say as a landowner, I'm just going to let natural regeneration take its course. It's a real shame, but the expense of replanting is very high. If you're under the Woodland Carbon Code, however, you must replant. Now, fire, wind, they can be insured against, and so it's not too much of an issue for many landowners, but for some it may be. And of course, you can't insure at the minute against pests and diseases. And so it's something that landowners should really consider, but hopefully is mitigated within the management plans, etc., etc. Next of all, you must verify, as I mentioned before, at least every 10 years, and that allows for that conversion of those PRUs, the promises to deliver carbon units, into WCUs. You then must manage your project as you initially outlined in your carbon calculations and your management plan. You must manage the woodland to the UK Forestry standard, and you potentially may have to buy back some units if all have been sold, and you had several catastrophes throughout the woodland lifespan, which meant that it wasn't going to generate as much carbon as you'd initially predicted. Again, I won't touch on that, but it is important for landowners to be aware of. Next of all, looking at a basic summary of processes and costs. So to look at the process initially, currently, you can register a project if the implementation date, so the date the first tree went in the ground, was less than 2 years ago. As of July this year, that rule is changing, and you must register your project before planting begins. If in July, which would be odd, you started planting your trees, and then you thought retrospectively, oh, we need to get it registered, you will not be eligible for joining the carbon code. So that is an important change that has recently been made in the code. If you take nothing away from this presentation other than that from me, that is the one. Next of all, you must then validate and plant your scheme within 3 years of that registration. And then year 5, after the scheme has been planted, you must verify your scheme. And then you must do that, as I mentioned before, at least every 10 years from that point onwards. Now, this is a very rough outline of the sort of costs landowners can expect to face. And I've broken them down into direct costs and indirect costs. So direct costs are to the market registry and to the validators or verifiers, such as the Soil Association or organic farmers and growers. And there is a big range, namely because there are a lot of you can reduce the cost quite significantly if you group the schemes together quite effectively. So going as an individual project is always going to be more expensive generally than if you group schemes together, but I won't touch on that because it's too complicated. Next of all is looking at the indirect costs, and they're the costs that you are likely to face if you wanted to bring a project developer into the mix, and they can help you from the inception and registration of the scheme all the way through to the ongoing verifications and monitoring. And they're the sort of costs, just in my experience, that I've seen out there, but of course that might change quite significantly. So next of all, the monetization of those carbon units, and I'm just conscious of time. So essentially you can monetize your carbon units in 2 primary ways, 3 if I include Chris's presentation next, looking at the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, where you're essentially selling your units to the government. But I'll let him touch on that. He knows far more about it than I do. So essentially the 2 ways I'm trying to illustrate here are you can either sell your units directly to a company, and those companies will buy your carbon units, and many project developers can help you in that process in terms of introducing you to investors, helping you through the, as I mentioned before, the registration and or the legal documents that need to be included. Or you can sell to what is known as a carbon trader. So you're selling to someone or a company that will then sell those units on for a profit to other companies. They're the 2 main routes, except for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, which Chris will come on to moving forwards. But I just wanted to mention that many companies now, or many purchasers and buyers, are looking at investing in more novel ways. So they're not necessarily saying, we will buy your units for £10 per tonne, and that is the way it's going to work. We're going to buy them all up front, for instance. Many are looking at annual payments to make it very similar to farming payments, and trying to work with landowners in more, as I say, innovative ways to make the cash flow work for them, rather than just a lump sum of money at different times, for instance. So the final thing is just looking at where to find some further information. First and foremost is have a look on the Woodland Carbon Code website. That explains things far better than I could in a 10-minute presentation. Next of all is the resources on the website, namely the Woodland Carbon Code Carbon Calculator. Now I'd recommend having a look at that, download it. If you've got a potential scheme moving forwards, have a play on the calculator and see the amount of carbon you might be able to sequester. To give you an idea, generally you're sequestering anywhere between 100 to 500 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. So if you're conservatively selling those at £10 per tonne, you can see quite quickly how landowners looking at that potentially £5,000 per hectare may become interested. And then finally, speak to the project developers. Now, there are a variety of project developers listed on the Carbon Code website, and so have a chat with them and they'll be able to help you through the processes, and the landowners will be able to get further information from them. But with that, as I say, I'm conscious of time, so I'll pass back to you, David, and thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Andy. Next, we have Chris Waterfield, the Forestry Commission's Carbon and Water Woodland Advisor for England. Chris has worked across the forestry sector in a variety of roles. He joined the Forestry Commission in 2002 to programme manage the Newlands project, which created over 600 hectares of new publicly accessible woodland across northwest England, until 2010, when he moved within the Commission to implement the Woodland Carbon Code. Since then, he's worked mainly in the north of England, in Yorkshire, the northeast, the northwest and the West Midlands. He is the author of the recent leaflet responding to the climate emergency with trees and woodlands, and has been in his current role since June 2019. Chris's presentation will cover carbon auctions. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, David. I'll share my screen now. Hopefully you can all see this coming on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about woodland carbon auctions, those that have happened already. I am the Carbon and Water Woodland Advisor for the Forestry Commission for England. The Woodland Carbon Guarantee sits in amongst the incentives that there are to create new woodlands in England. It is an English thing only. But you can see from this slide here, we have a number of incentives moving forwards for woodland creation. The Woodland Creation Planning Grant, as you all know, has changed now to encompass woodlands over 5 hectares in size. And you'll notice in the middle section, from spring being a very variable feast, 2021, we will have some new woodland creation grants in England. I can't tell you much about those at the moment because the information is pretty much embargoed, but it will be being announced fairly soon. I must also say that I can't say anything at this point about things which are to come, apart from dates maybe, because we are in a pre-election period. But you can see that Woodland Carbon Code there sits in our carbon finance area with the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. What's the background of the Woodland Carbon Guarantee then? Well, it was past the 25-year environment plan and announced in the November 2018 budget, and has £50 million allocated to it over 35 years. Over the past year, we have allocated almost half of that funding already. So if you take away one thing from this talk today, think we've allocated half the funding, there's only half left for you to get your hands on. So the goal is to accelerate woodland planting rates and to develop a domestic market for woodland carbon. We're also looking at creating woodlands that are permanent carbon stores. We're going to contract, the government that is going to contract to buy carbon at a price that's above the carbon market price at the moment and index linked. And it's an option to sell to the government. I'll explain that in a few minutes. As I said, it's England only, but it is not a grant. It's an additional income stream for the 35-year period, traditionally before any income starts being generated from a new woodland. That 35-year period is a contract that has guaranteed payments for you whilst you're watching your trees grow. It's available in addition to existing grants. So all of those grants that I mentioned before you can use at the same time as applying for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. All projects must be validated and verified under the Woodland Carbon Code, which means that they must share the same eligibility criteria for the Woodland Carbon Code, whether or not those projects are infill of new woodlands, or they are of existing woodlands rather, or they are new woodlands in their entirety. Initially, it's not for the public sector. So we could have opened this to the public sector forestry and probably allocated it all in one go. But we decided not to. We decided that actually it was the private sector that needed some help in moving forwards within the sector. And that is traditionally where government works to create and to rectify market failure. So access is via an auction process. Eligibility. I shortened this this slide down this morning drastically, just to say that you need to meet the Woodland Carbon Code eligibility criteria. It's as simple as that. In all cases, you'll not be eligible if you've started any work on site before receiving an offer of a contract from government. What do you need to do? Well, it's exactly the same as if you were creating a woodland anyway. You identify land, you decide what you want to plant, you calculate using the calculator that Andy was talking about, you calculate how much carbon the woodland is going to sequester, and you register the land with the Woodland Carbon Code. You apply for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. That application requires a map, a price, and some contact details. You participate in the auction, so you submit your price to the auction. You get one chance to submit your price, but you can change that price all the way up until the auction closes. You then validate your project under the Woodland Carbon Code by planting the trees into the ground as you'd expect and as you would. And after validation and over time, you will verify those projects every 5 or 10 years or so. And you're verifying the woodland carbon units are there. When you verify that those woodland carbon units are there, you can come to the government and say, the contract that we have, remember that? Well, I'd like to sell you these woodland carbon units. And the government, because we have a contract with you, will say, yes, we remember that contract, we will buy your units. It's as simple as that. But actually, in effect, if the price in the private market is above the agreed price you have with the government, you can sell in the private market. All you need to do is tell the government that you're not going to sell to them. Just a few bits about what you'll see when you join the auction. Once you've registered, you get a PIN number, and that PIN number allows you to make a bid on Nature Bid. That's the website on above. At the top of the screen, rather. I will check whether there should be an E in Nature Bid, because it looks strange to me, but I did copy that straight from the website. But that's your landing page, and you can see very, very easily that it's a very simple thing. You actually just get asked, I hope some people on the call have done this, you actually just get asked to submit your bid. What price are you selling? So, previous auctions have generated potentially 2,300 hectares of new woodlands to be created since auction started in January 2020. That first auction, which had a £10 million budget, successfully attracted 182 hectares of new woodland to be created from 31 projects. There were 18 successful bids with an average price per tonne of carbon of £24, 50p, I think it was. The second auction in June 2020, with a £10 million budget, attracted 77 projects and 27 successful bids. This auction was dominated by one bidder, and it was a very successful auction with 1,517 hectares of new woodland potentially being created. And the third auction in October-November 2020, with a similar £10 million budget, was very successful again, 620 hectares of new woodland. Average price, you'll notice this is going down again, is £17.31. This is a little bit of a feature of reverse auctions. You do seem to find that the price goes down. We are in a discovery phase with auctions on the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, and we are finding, yes, that price does go down as people realise how to bid. The fourth auction will be in July 2021. I can't tell you any more than that at the moment, but it will be in July 2021. So please start to get ready. Remember, register your projects with the Woodland Carbon Code and make your calculation in readiness. So you get a contract, as I said, with HM Government and the applicant. It's linked to a specific Woodland Carbon Code project and is with the applicant. But if the Woodland Carbon Code project changes, you need to tell the government. You provide an option to sell to the government, but you can also keep the units and sell them on the private market. The contract is issued once the site has been validated by the Woodland Carbon Code, and the price agreed at auction is index linked to the time of verification. The contract can be transferred to someone else, but only with our agreement. And as you'd expect me to say, there's some advice, or some words, not advice actually, some words on taxation. Profits arising from a commercial occupation of woodlands are not chargeable to income tax and corporation tax, and the value attributable to trees is exempt from capital gains tax. The sale of voluntary carbon credits is not currently chargeable to VAT. However, the Forestry Commission cannot provide any official tax advice, and applicants should always seek professional independent advice based on their specific circumstances, making any long-term investments. Phew, that's the bit that I have to say. It's like the quick bit at the end of an advert. But just to finish up, there are a couple of links there for you. By the looks of things, I copied the address wrong because the Woodland Carbon Guarantee auction address is repeated on this last page. Thanks very much for listening. I'm going to hand back to David, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thanks very much, Chris. We've now got David McCulloch, and David is the head of Carbon Store. He has a BSc Hons in accounting, finance and economics, and 18 years experience in the financial sector, based in both London and Tokyo. Initially as an equity salesman and latterly as a corporate analyst. Today, David will be discussing carbon as an investment. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, David, and good morning. And I'll just get my presentation up, and I hope you can all see that. And today I'm going to talk more about a point which Andy touched on in his presentation in terms of the investment opportunities associated with woodland carbon and forestry. And woodland carbon, because of the timing of its income streams, is transforming the forestry investment market. And traditionally, the buyer of plantable land would have had to wait almost 40 years before realizing any meaningful income from his investment, i.e. from harvesting the timber. And the decline in UK interest rates, which that chart shows, from almost 18% back in the late 70s to around 1% now, has sharply reduced the discount factor that you apply to those far out timber related revenues. And that has therefore been the biggest single driver on commercial forestry values over the past 40 years. And in contrast to that, the income from woodland generated carbon units can be realized shortly after planting. And as a result, even at current values of those woodland carbon credits, woodland carbon accounts for almost 30% of a commercial forestry investor's per hectareage income. And I'll show this through the following example. So one very standard hectare of Sitka spruce should yield approximately 465 tonnes of timber. And assuming we sell each tonne for about 40 pounds, the hectare will generate 18,600 pounds of timber income in 40 years' time. However, we must also apply a discount rate to reflect the opportunity cost of having to wait so long for that timber income. And assuming a 3% discount rate or an interest rate, the present value of that far out 18,600 pounds is actually just 5,766 pounds. Meantime, over its 40-year lifespan, that forest is also sequestering approximately 200 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And current prices for woodland carbon from a commercial plantation are very approximately £12.50 per PIU. And that means 1 hectare of forestry could generate £2,500 in carbon income. And because it can be sold in year naught, it is not subject to any discounting factor. So the present value of the income from 1 hectare of commercial forestry is therefore approximately £8,300, as you can see in the presentation. And that's made up of about £5,800 from the timber, and then the remaining £2,500 from woodland carbon. So as an entirely new but increasingly significant component of forestry income, woodland carbon is understandably having a very powerful impact on prices of plantable land. And in 2020, it was estimated that the value of poor quality Scottish livestock farmland rose 17.5% year on year, as, and I quote a recent report, environmentally motivated buyers began to compete for land with forestry planting potential. And meantime, elsewhere, another report on UK land prices was saying the rise of green investors, i.e. those with carbon capture, afforestation and carbon accreditation objectives, has intensified competitive interest in Scottish estates. This level of interest is being heightened by optimism surrounding the future value of carbon credits, the PIUs and the WCUs, which Andy explained earlier. As I mentioned on the previous page, these are currently available for roughly £12 to £13 each, though they are higher in southern England. However, the level of potential demand, the current value of carbon credits on the EU emission trading scheme, and the income levels from tree planting which are needed to compete against agriculture mean many expect the value of PIUs and WCUs to rise up towards 30, 40, or even £50 each. And these environmentally motivated buyers can be broadly categorized into 3 types. Firstly, there are companies looking to buy land which they plant with trees whose growth will offset their carbon emissions. And because they are offsetting their emissions with internally owned assets, this type of investment is known as insetting. Secondly, there are private investors, and many of these are attracted by the inheritance tax advantages of forestry ownership and the income tax benefits of carbon and timber income, which Chris touched on a moment ago. And finally, there are pension, insurance and endowment funds, known as institutional investors. And they are attracted both by the capital gains that are available from forestry ownership and the upside potential for prices of the PRUs and the WCUs. For us in the forestry industry, these new types of landowners are interesting for various reasons. Firstly, they are changing the traditional pattern of rural land ownership away from one that's been dominated by farmers and estates. And given the representatives of these new buyers are largely urban-based, this will inevitably bring new changes and new dynamics to employment and occupations and interests in rural communities. New owners also bring new perspectives, and details of the Brewdog Forest with plans for sustainability retreats, ecotourism, and the opportunity to reconnect people with nature offers a guide to that new direction. Finally, new perspectives also bring new requirements, and in 2019, conifers accounted for 67% of all new planting in Scotland. But if Brewdog's intentions are representative, then that weighting might decline in coming years. So these investors face important considerations when they're drawing up income, costs and cash flow forecasts associated with their investment. Firstly, it is important that they understand the fixed costs that are associated with operating a scheme under the Woodland Carbon Code. The process of validation costs very approximately 2,000 to 2,500 once the auditor's fees, the time taken to gather the project design documents and the administration charges levied by the UK Land Carbon Registry are considered. Each verification then costs a further, again, this is very approximate, £1,600, which when occurring 6 times over a period of roughly 55 years, mounts up over a project's lifetime. And as a result, a 30-hectare scheme with a 55-year duration could see its total fixed costs associated with the Woodland Carbon Code rise towards £12,000 to £13,000. And admittedly, it is worth pointing out, this can be reduced significantly if the project is placed in a group scheme. But nonetheless, it does place a floor on the size of schemes for which carbon funding is commercially viable. And that floor seems to be somewhere between 2.5 and 3 hectares. Investors must also understand when and in what form they would like to generate income from their woodlands. And please forgive the slightly simplistic distinction between conifers and broadleaves here, but it does help illustrate the point. Conifers will sequester about 200 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare, and that drops to about 150 tonnes if you are thinning it. The owner can also look forward to substantial timber income in 40 years' time, as I explained earlier. In contrast, broadleaves are expected to sequester almost 600 tonnes per hectare. And with the PRUs attached to broadleaf schemes also commanding slightly higher prices than those from conifer schemes, the owners of such projects can generate significantly more carbon-related income, although any timber income is a more remote prospect. And finally, investors must decide when to realise their carbon-related income. In theory, the owner of a newly planted woodland can sell all their PRUs shortly after validation. However, in practice, many sell only a portion of their PRUs, maybe 30 or 40%, while holding back the remaining 60 to 70% for the future. And the owner's decision on this point really depends on their interpretation of 2 well-known sayings. On the one hand, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. And what I mean by that is who knows what will happen to future carbon prices. But their current value generates attractive income, and it seems sensible to take the opportunity while it's available to the owner. On the other hand, it is also important not to count your chickens before they hatch. And by selling carbon credits before the trees have grown, the owner could be making exactly that mistake. And the best course probably lies, as with many things, somewhere between those two extremes. And with that, thank you for listening, and I will pass back to David.
Thank you, David. And just a reminder to everyone to, if you've got a question, please post it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to questions after our final presentation, which is from Ilona Coulson-Ashworth, Carbon Projects Manager at the Woodland Trust. Since receiving an MSc in Agricultural Economics from the University of Reading in 2017, Ilona has worked in carbon markets as a project developer. She started her career developing and expanding improved cook stoves and borehole carbon projects in East Africa under the gold standard, CDM and Vera standards. Ilona joined the Woodland Trust, one of the UK's leading or largest conservation charities, in November 2020. She manages the expanding portfolio of Woodland Carbon Code and peatland Carbon Code projects across the UK, putting nature and conservation at the forefront. Ilona will be discussing carbon as a nature-based solution. So over to you, Ilona.
Thanks, David. And thank you to the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group as well for inviting the Woodland Trust to host a presentation. So I'm just going to start, my presentation is on nature-based solutions. I'm just going to start and talk about maybe a question that you have on your mind, which is why the Woodland Trust would get involved with the Carbon Code. So why the Trust as an NGO entered the carbon market, why the Carbon Code is needed to encourage woodland creation, and applying our conservation principles to the Woodland Carbon Code. So as a charity, our objectives are to conserve, restore, re-establish trees, and in particular native broadleaf trees, plants and all forms of wildlife. And our vision is one of a UK rich in native woods and trees for people and wildlife. So woodland creation fits our organisation, it fits our charitable aims, and carbon is a newly valued commodity that is an enabler of woodland creation. And as a charity, we survive off funding. So any funding that kind of meets our charitable aims, we're very much interested in exploring and getting involved with. So my presentation is going to be based on the 10 golden rules for reforestation. I've adapted this paper for afforestation in relation to the Woodland Carbon Code, but it's based on the most recent ecological research, creating woodland that maximises both carbon sequestration and biodiversity recovery. So we'll go through the 10 rules. The first one being protecting existing forest first. So enhancing existing forest through management, introducing age classes, species variation, continuous cover, silviculture. And it's just really important. You know, our existing forests are carbon stores, so we can't forget about those with all the talk of woodland creation. And ancient woodland restoration, as you may or may not know, is the Woodland Trust bread and butter. So a recent paper published last week, The State of UK Woods and Trees, by the Woodland Trust last Tuesday, it came out, had some really interesting findings, and one of them was the total amount of carbon in living trees in ancient long established woodland sites across Great Britain is estimated to be 77 million tonnes. So this equates to 40 million tonnes in England, 27 million tonnes in Scotland, and 10 million tonnes in Wales. So it's really critical that we look after those carbon stores of existing woodland and forest first. The second point is to work together. So having interactive participation at every project phase. And as a charity, we work with local communities and volunteers. And volunteers provide a community provision of labour for land preparation, planting, and maintenance of a forest. And also they can really provide protection in the long term, because site managers can't be on site all the time. So volunteers are really key communicating body for us to make sure that we know what's happening on our sites and how well they're doing. And stakeholder consultation as well, which is very much a compulsory part of the grant schemes. But even if you don't go under a grant scheme, it's very much, it's documented in the project design document under the Woodland Carbon Code. So it's really important to engage your neighbours and stakeholders, just to make sure you tell them what you're doing. And that could have a positive influence as well on woodland creation and potentially sway them to do the same. So the third point is aiming to maximise biodiversity to meet multiple goals. And those goals are climate change mitigation through carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation through protecting and enhancing native flora and fauna, socioeconomic benefits, the health and well-being improvements felt by local communities involved in, and visiting woodland creation, potential volunteering opportunities that can come about from that, depending on your aims of the woodland creation. The soil and hydrological stability that trees are fantastic in providing, and other ecosystem services that maximise habitat provision to a diversity of native species. So there's lots of different things that you can do with your woodland creation that go beyond carbon. Step 4, kind of selecting appropriate areas for afforestation. So, you always hear foresters talk about the right tree in the right place. What was the land forested in the past? To be eligible under the Woodland Carbon Code, it can't have been forested in the last 25 years, any more than 20% canopy cover. But re-establishing a species-rich forest in a place that was historically, so kind of way before 25 years, if you go through historic maps, establishing that species-rich forest in a place that's beneficial for both biodiversity and conservation and carbon sequestration, it can be really beneficial. Does the land have areas of wetland, peatland, or species-rich grassland? And this is sort of coming into the fore now as research comes out, but these three critical areas store a lot of below ground carbon sequestration. So our knowledge is increasing with research, and that's where the right tree in the right place becomes critical. So we would be identifying those no-go zones and no planting initiatives where these pieces of land exist, kind of specific areas of habitat. And what are the wider effects of the woodland creation in the target area? That includes impacts on groundwater, biodiversity, climate, ecosystem services, livelihoods, and you can list many more. Another point is how close is the woodland to other areas of woodland? Can you think about creating those buffer zones, corridors, stepping stones, enabling native species to be able to migrate between the woodland remnants, and not just thinking as a sole site, but thinking as part of a landscape. How can you change and impact that in terms of conservation, biodiversity, and in terms of carbon sequestration as well? And just thinking about the current land use and any leakage. So will changing the land use to woodland, to forestry, push the activities that were already taking place on the project site elsewhere, and causing a land use change elsewhere? And is that going to become carbon intensive elsewhere as well? So just thinking about those things before starting the project, and also making the Woodland Carbon Code aware if you think that that's going to affect the project. Step 5, using natural regeneration wherever possible. So natural regeneration can be a cheaper and more effective way than tree planting where site and landscape conditions are suitable. And existing vegetation can really determine the regeneration pathway and whether your site is applicable for that. And different levels of intervention may be required within a single large site. So, to be aware, in natural regeneration can be slow to establish with regards to carbon and also with regards to the trees, but it can be a really great hub for carbon sequestration and wildlife conservation, and that can really maximise it. So under the new standard of the Woodland Carbon Code that was released in March, they're referring natural regeneration, natural colonisation are terms that are interchangeably used. And it's applicable to current cover of established trees. They should be less than 20%, so not a woodland, as we're only looking at new woodland creation schemes here. And areas for natural regen should be within 50 metres of the seed source to be an upfront claimable area. And what that means is that you can claim the PIUs on areas within 50 metres of the seed source. But if you do have areas where you've got evidence of natural regeneration that's potentially being suppressed currently, beyond the 50-metre boundary that we're suggesting here, then do get in touch with the Woodland Carbon Code, because that still could be eligible, and you can start claiming for those units up at the time of first verification. So all is not lost in that case. You need to achieve at least 400 stems per hectare, and the start date is the date where fencing and deer control is in place, and that project starts to account for carbon sequestration. So it's really important to get your project registered before you start doing any activities on site in terms of fencing. The next step is selecting species to maximise biodiversity. So as David said in his presentation, mixed native woodland in perpetuity has a lot more potential to sequester carbon than conifer woodland managed on a commercial basis, if we go with those two stark examples. But it has the, mixed native woodland in perpetuity has the potential to sequester upwards of 400 tonnes of carbon per hectare over 100 years. So it can be quite lucrative in terms of carbon, and also fantastic for maximising biodiversity and conservation. I'm flying through this, so the next slide is number 7, using resilient plant material. So at the Woodland Trust, we use only UK and Ireland sourced and grown seeds. And our procurement processes ensure that every tree we use and supply has been sourced and grown within the British Isles. So each tree is fully traceable from seed collection through to planting. And this really ensures the survival and resilience of planted trees. And I think it's really vital to use material of appropriate levels of genetic diversity, consistent with local and regional genetic variation. And it's central to developing those resilient woodlands, and really limits the risk of spreading arboreal diseases and pests through plant imports that we've seen in the last few years. So yeah, and the next point is planning ahead for infrastructure. So this is a lot that people will already know, particularly working in the forestry industry, but are you planning to direct seed, natural root colonisation or planting on the site? Obviously, we know tree and seed orders need to be in advance, and contract availability and thinking about that. The grant timeframe is about 12 months in advance, and now we're thinking about the Woodland Carbon Code as well, and registering projects from the 1st of July, registering those projects before you've done any work on site. So it's really important to think in advance about your income streams, which you're forced to do with the grant system, but now also with the Woodland Carbon Code. And aligning those early sources of income with the procurement of trees can be tricky. And also thinking about wildlife management, a long time before the woodland is established, because you've got to think about how you're going to manage that fencing, and all of that goes into the design and the grant systems. So I suppose people are really aware of this anyway already. But there's never been a better time. There's never been more income streams for woodland creation. So as that demand is increasing, with the creation of woodland, and potentially the new grant systems in England in particular that are coming to the fore, it's really important to think further in advance about creating the woodland and planning ahead for the infrastructure of getting everything in place to make sure that you create that woodland that you're wanting and that you're thinking about, and you're not having to make compromises on seed orders at the last minute. So it's really important to plan ahead. Learning by doing. So for the enthusiastic, I suppose, use science and local knowledge. You see what's growing, observe what's growing well around you on similar soils if you're unsure about species choice. And go further with soil sampling and understanding the soil type and what will grow best. I still feel like there's a lot of research and misunderstanding about soil, and the more we can learn, the better we can plan the woodlands and trees and what grows best, particularly a mix. Plants and birds as biodiversity indicators. Different trees support different species. So have a mix and support that variety of local birds and plants. And do you, in the particular area that you're in your local area, do you have any endangered species that you can provide habitat for with a new woodland? And that, that's really critical in terms of conservation, if you can do that. And if you're really enthusiastic, trialing small-scale planting to guide species choice, particularly if you're waiting for the new grant systems to come out, you could start that now and plant things and see what goes well and see what doesn't and see what's working. So as the last point, slide number 10, make it pay. So like I said before, it's never been better time to create woodland in terms of the different income streams that you can get. And some of them I've outlined here. So the Woodland Carbon Code, which Andy talked about, the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, which was touched on by Chris's presentation, woodland creation grants in all the regions of the UK. Particularly at the Woodland Trust, we have the Morewood scheme for those smaller schemes that are currently not covered by some of the current grant systems. I know that's changing. But if you live in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and you'd like to plant trees on a small woodland, and you'd like the Woodland Trust help in creating that woodland, and we can cover up to 60% of cost for that woodland creation over 1 hectare. So do get in touch if you're interested. I can point you in the right direction within the trust. There's income from thinnings of the woodland, and that can all be incorporated under the Woodland Carbon Code as well. So don't think because you're going under carbon you can't thin the woodland. You absolutely can, but you just need to make that clear at the start of the project. And if you're managing the woodland on a commercial basis, there's obviously the timber income as well. And just as a last point, in case people are interested, what would the Woodland Trust carbon looks like? The Woodland Trust has corporate partners that wish to offset their carbon footprint with us, and they work with us as a holistic means to reducing their impact on the climate and the environment. And generally we find UK businesses want to offset in the UK. Buyers can physically visit any of our sites and see the woodland that they've helped to create. And they're also open to the public as well. All seeds, like I said before, are UK and Ireland sourced and grown. And the woodlands are enjoyed by the public. All our woodlands are designed with conservation outcomes at the forefront that meet our charitable aims. So that's really critical for us. And the trees are managed in perpetuity to capture the most carbon. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I shall pass back to David.
Thanks, Ilona. I'm now going to ask all our presenters if they can turn back on their microphones and cameras for the Q&A session, and a reminder that if you do have a question or even a discussion point, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also joining the panel is John Weir, advisor for woodland creation and resilience in the Forestry Commission, and today he's representing the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group. So the first question is from Alamina Deo Fasolijo, and apologies if I've got your mispronounced your name there, wrong there. But quick one for, I think for Andy Baker. Can African countries, especially Nigeria, benefit from the Woodland Carbon Code?
So at the minute, the carbon code can only be used to formally offset emissions from the UK, and so UK-based emissions for companies. However, we are having a lot of foreign investors wanting to invest purely for the credentials of the carbon code, because it is such a high standard of offsetting that they are looking to invest purely for those reasons, and because the carbon code can quantify the amount of carbon. So that means that you would be able to invest from Nigeria, but you wouldn't be able to formally claim it in your company's greenhouse gas inventory. Now, the main reason for that is based on double counting. They don't want companies in the UK or the UK government claiming for those emissions reductions and the Nigerian government. So that's the major issue with, and the main reason why it's only for UK-based emissions.
Thanks, Andy. And one for you now, David, from Eddie Addis. Can the fixed costs associated with the Woodland Carbon Code, e.g. validation and verification, can they be taken into account in the additionality calculations?
Yes, in a nutshell, they can, and there's actually a specific line for those costs in the code's most recent version of the additionality calculator. So yes, Eddie, in a nutshell, they can.
Okay, this one from David Ruddock, probably for you, Chris. I think you're probably best to answer this. Can woodlands created with the carbon guarantee also attract revenues from stacked bundled ecosystem service benefits such as biodiversity offset, i.e. net gain, or flood risk mitigation?
Yes, they can, if they explain how that meets additionality, or how the additionality rules are met in the beginning of the project. If you're actually proposing that those are something you'll do in the future, but you need to do the carbon element now, stick them into the additionality calculations, and we see how they make the project work once they materialise.
Okay, here's another one for you, Andy, I think from Johan von Pezold. What are the restrictions on commercial timber harvesting in terms of the Woodland Carbon Code?
It's a good question. So there are no restrictions whatsoever. You can commercially clear fell, you can thin your woodland. You just need to make sure you declare it at the start of your registration process. And so if you are going to clear fell, I know there's a question later on talking about trying to accommodate harvested wood products and that sort of thing. So essentially the Woodland Carbon Code only accounts for carbon sequestered within the woodland gate. And so what they try to do with a clear fell scheme, for instance, is say, okay, even though for, let's say, a 40-year clear fell rotation, you have planted the trees, they've sequestered 1,000 tons of carbon, then at year 40, you've cut them all down. So you're net zero, you've not really sequestered any carbon. Well, you have held carbon within that woodland for 40 years. And so there is some sequestration benefit that the Carbon Code assigns to that. It's about, if you were to clear fell a woodland that would have sequestered 500 tons per hectare, and you were going to be clear felling it every 40 years, let's say, you'd get approximately 150 to 200 carbon units. So commercial forestry is trying to get that balancing act, what's fair, really, and I hope that kind of answers your question.
Okay, one for you, David, specifically addressed to you from Tom Blackwood. How, if at all, do you see the price of PRUs differing from WCUs?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it touches on various points, because firstly, you know, what is the market price for a WCU? And Chris's work has done a lot of good in understanding what the floor price is for those WCUs. But we really need much more transparency and openness within the woodland carbon market overall, so that we all understand what the going rate is for a WCU and also a PRU. I mean, sort of, do I see the price of PRUs differing from WCUs? In theory, Tom, the difference between a WCU and a PRU should be the risk that you associate or that you attach, that PRU, that promise to deliver, doesn't then turn into a verified WCU. But in practice, what's happening in practice is you've got, I mean, the floor price from Chris is what, £17 or so that you guys got at the last auction. And, you know, we're looking at broadleaf schemes which are generating about £15 per PRU. So does that reflect the risk? Well, I suppose actually on balance, perhaps it does. But the market is very new, and it's difficult to answer your question categorically on that one.
Okay, thanks, David. Here's another one for you from Richard Powell. And he's asking you, he says you described the three types of investors, but what about existing estates and owner-occupier farmers? Are they not also showing an interest in woodland creation motivated by carbon revenue? This interest does seem to be starting in England.
Yeah, I mean, they are definitely showing an interest, and this is absolutely central to, you know, if the government is going to achieve its planting targets for 30,000 hectares a year, and the Woodland Carbon Code is going to provide that financial incentive to encourage planting up, you know, sort of the more marginal parts of agricultural land. And, you know, as we get towards 2035 and 2040, and we've planted up the easy patches, we're going to need to start sort of, you know, considering other areas for planting. So, you know, participation from those estates and from owner occupiers is vital, and it is definitely coming through. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, it's quite a long question on a number of multiple questions that were maybe spread around the panel from Tom Locatelli. And maybe if goes to you first for this one, John. He's asking, would it be possible to hear from the speakers how risks from natural hazards are considered in the various stages of the Woodland Carbon Code and carbon guarantee processes for the lifetime of the accredited forest, and are the risks reduced? Are risks of reduced growth, i.e. the amount of carbon sequestered, considered in addition to catastrophic danger or catastrophic damage? Do you want to have a go at that, John?
Yeah, I can answer part of the question, but not the main header. I find myself thinking about this and saying, you know, we are in a climate emergency, and that's something that we know, and it's man-made. I think it's really got to be clear that people do define the objectives of what they're trying to do, and then seek out the actual knowledge that's available. Some of the forest research tools, particularly towards the south of the country, actually say that productivity in tree species is likely to decline in the face of doing, you know, no adaptation. Now, I can't say I know the process properly, and I would like to think Andy would. It would seem very odd to me that you would take the best available knowledge from forest research and then underpin something where the science is suggesting productivity is actually going to decline. That would seem a very bizarre situation for us to get into. I'm sorry, I can't talk about mechanics.
No, that's absolutely fine. It is one for discussion, and
I would say, David, it seems to be the sort of elephant in the room that people don't seem to be talking about particularly, is the negative impact. But equally, we've got to say there's a positive impact in parts of the UK. But the knowledge is there, and I'm sure when the insurance business really starts to get its mind around it, people offering insurance, if the best available tools say without adaptation the species is going to decline, why should we put money there?
Okay. Do you, Chris, want to have a contribution based on, you know, the involvement of the carbon guarantee in terms of
I will.
risks?
Yeah, that's fine. I think for the Woodland Carbon Code and the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, risks are taken into account when you're making your calculation, when you're doing your putting your project together. Certainly, we make sure people use ESC, the ecological site assessment tool. We'd encourage them to use the climate matching tool as well, and make sure that they use some form of management tool, some sort of estimating management tool, so that you can actually you can look at all of these risks, see what the levels of danger to fire might be by looking at the acceptable or the predicted climate for 2050, 2080. Those all come into the calculation of your carbon sequestered. And also, as a kind of insurance policy for the Woodland Carbon Code and the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, in so doing, there is a contribution made to a project buffer. And the Woodland Carbon Code has a universal buffer which covers every project within its sign up, and that is currently 20% of the predicted carbon units get put into that buffer, just in case your project suffers from fire, pest, disease, wind blow, whatever, so that you can rely on those units that other people have also put in if your woodland has a catastrophic event. What happens then is you replant, as Andy was saying, and essentially you can't use any units on your replanted site until you've got to the point where your prediction says you were back to where you were before. I think it's fair to say we cover risk, but you should also use insurance. And John, I think you were saying carbon insurance has got to come. with all of this, if the carbon market is going to grow, carbon insurance is going to grow as well. And I think that will probably take away the use of the buffer.
Okay, so potential business opportunity for
absolutely
insurance providers out there. So hopefully, Tom, that's covered and answering your questions. We've got a couple of shorter ones here from Eger Grassmain, and this is probably a quick one for you, Andy. Are private forest owners engaging in carbon market with their existing growing forests in England?
So as I mentioned before, the Woodland Carbon Code only accounts for new woodland creation. So we have a lot of landowners who have their own woodlands who are looking at planting new woodlands to generate carbon units, but at the moment, no, they can't register their existing growing forests with the Woodland Carbon Code.
Okay, thanks, Andy. And one for Ilona. Our Woodland Trust, this is again from Ada, are the Woodland Trust competing in the land market with private owners?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to this is yes. You know, we've entered into the carbon market, and we're there along with commercial and other forestry organisations also including landowners as well. And we're also working with private landowners as well to realise their carbon goals. So yes, would be the answer.
Okay, thank you. Fair enough. Richard Powell is more of a sort of discussion point than maybe a direct question. But he's saying mixed native woodland managed on a non-intervention basis will sequester most carbon long term. But what about the benefits of applying softwood from woodlands for use in construction, where they potentially displace steel, concrete, etc., that has a much higher carbon footprint? Do we not have to think about this in the round? So I guess that's one for about the development of where the Woodland Carbon Code goes. So do you want to have a go at that one, Chris, and then maybe Andy?
Yeah, no problem. Richard, yes, you're probably right about the non-intervention mixed woodland being the one that predicts the most carbon sequestration, but it doesn't do the most for the timber industry, does it? What we probably want to see is that woodland at a non-intervention, if you wanted to use some of the timber that was being removed to as substitution for concrete and steel, that at the beginning of the programme you look at choosing the thinned option for your woodland, which essentially turns it into a woodland with intervention. That reduces the amount of carbon that is sequestered in your wood over the period of time, but it does allow for you to extract timber and still rely on the carbon sequestration predictions that you've been promising. At the moment, there is no code for harvested wood products. That's one that needs to come. It's one that we'd be probably willing to help with if the industry, the forest industry was wanting to do it, but also B, if the construction industry also showed any interest in wanting to look at accounting for its substituted goods. At the moment, I don't hear any interest from the construction industry, but maybe it's because we need to shout louder and ask the questions harder. So, yeah, Richard, you can, we should, and in many ways we do already. But we need to remember that the Woodland Carbon Code assumes that timber that's removed from a woodland vaporizes when it leaves the forest gate.
Okay, Caroline there is actually adding to the discussion and saying that's where she feels that the Woodland Carbon Code falls short in the calculation of the harvested wood products and the carbon stored construction, etc. So I think that's one that is going to become a recurring theme as time goes on. Right, another one here from Yakubu Suleiman. A long question, I haven't pre-read it, but I'm from northwestern Nigeria, I am a northwestern Nigerian where most of our forests have been degraded, and most of the communities are agricultural crops, farmers in which we, the volunteers on the forest regeneration, I think I'm struggling to determine what the question is. Do you want to have a go at that, Andy? Yeah.
I'd just say on that one, just feel free to get in touch with Kubu, and we'll have a chat about expanding your carbon trading market as well. Because as I say, just with the Nigerian question earlier, it's only used for UK-based emissions, and so helping you develop your own internal national carbon market is something that we'd be more than happy to help with. So get in touch with me after the webinar, and I'll have a chat with you about that.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Andy. You helped me out on that one. Naim Waldron, I have tried to contact, this is one for you, Ilona. I've tried to contact the Woodland Trust to discuss a possible plan, but as yet I've not heard back, getting a recorded COVID-19 delay, but also a statement that says that no further trees are available, etc. Please can I ask for a contact email to speak with someone, thank you. So presumably the contact details were on your last slide, weren't they?
Yes, they were, and I think they can be sent around after this after this webinar as well to get in contact with me. Just to say that the Woodland Trust went through a cyber attack at the beginning of this year, end of last year, so that's probably another reason for the delay. And we are coming towards the end of the planting season now, so there are no more trees to be planted, but it restarts again in the autumn. So please get in touch.
Okay, another one for you, Ilona. The James Hepburn Scott is saying that the rowan tree on your slide appeared to be planted on a mound on peaty soil. Can you comment on that from a carbon perspective?
Sure. I mean, I can't give a clear answer here, but I can say that the Woodland Trust is reviewing the evidence about planting on peaty soils, and we're going to make the necessary adaptations and plan and design woodland creation projects on peat soils. That information is going to be released in the next planting season, so our conservation team is currently doing research into it, but thank you for pointing that out, James.
Thank you. Somebody called N. Cranston, could schools and universities be eligible to get grants if they develop schemes bundling land together? That's maybe one for you, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of universities that are doing exactly that, banding together into groups of universities as well and pooling their resources together. And it's a great marketing side of things, being able to have every student that comes in plant a tree and that sort of thing. And the carbon code works within that sort of framework as well. So yeah, crack on. Okay,
and I think you partly answered this in your presentation from somebody called C. Reed, but there's an additional part to it. Can hedges and agroforestry count under the Woodland Carbon Code?
So as Ilona mentioned before, for natural regeneration, that 400 stems per hectare, that's the target that you need to be able to hit. So if your agroforestry scheme can do that, then yes, there is the potential. But I don't want to say categorically yes, absolutely, or no, definitely not. Hedges though, no, definitely not. So I can't say categorically there for now. But as I say, that will be coming in the future, hopefully.
Right, one from Ben Clinch. And he's saying, under the 10 golden rules on the strong market for all woodland creation land, displacing existing rural business and jobs, how is the carbon market going to ensure that jobs are maintained, i.e. reskilled, and if possible, grow jobs? Who wants to volunteer to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take it, David.
Okay, David.
No, I think this is actually a really significant opportunity for the countryside. And I think the countryside has a really, I mean, if you read the Climate Change Committee's recommendations within land use policies for a net zero UK by 2050, it's you know, the countryside has a vital central part to play in helping us achieve that goal. And that is gonna, I mean, essentially, you know, what the woodland carbon market represents is largely a flow of money from mainly, you know, sort of urban-based companies into the rural sector. And that's a really positive thing. And and it'll bring new skills and it'll bring new opportunities.
Okay, I think, John, you want to say something about net zero?
Yeah, it's maybe a slightly embarrassing bit because I'm referring to my own age here. When I started off in this game, there was whole Sherpa vans of people piling out of offices to go and do work. Now, yeah, I fully appreciate we made quite a lot of mistakes, but we were delivering what the government asked at that time. And that was, a strategic reserve of timber, which hindsight, maybe we don't need again. But I'm really conscious that the whole dynamics have changed as we've gone into this decade, with this report saying, we're trying to get to net zero. And the recommendation behind that of 30,000 hectares of planting per year, or woodland creation, because it's not all going to be through tree planting, is taking us back to that same scenario that I joined in the 1970s. And I suppose the one thing that worries me a little bit in just our general thinking, because I believe in just tree growing, that's my own thought, but the ambitions stated within net zero that the government published was for high yield class and sequestration of a lot of timber. And quite rightly, we've got a biodiversity crisis running at the same time. But for me, that makes the stronger case for multidiscipline woodlands, because, we import 80% of the timber we currently use. And what I'm looking at currently in terms of meeting net zero, I struggle because we've been set up to achieve something that I can't see under the current direction we're going to get anywhere near it.
Right, okay. A bit of a downer there, but...
Oh, it's not meant as a downer. It's for us as an industry, all of us pulling together, recognising the many ways we can go forward, is to recognise it's not one option of let's go rewilding or one option, let's turn complete production. We need to engage as a group. And that's strongly why I support the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group, because we brought together a group of people with vastly different aspirations, but also with a real strong desire to deliver something different going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. This is a question specifically addressed to you, Chris. It appears that carbon credits only exist for woodland and peat, right? Has there been any traction on payment for ecosystem services relating to other nature-based solutions? Are you aware of any?
I know that there's research going on, or certainly a desire for research to go on into salt marsh and seagrass sequestration and a soil carbon code. But as yet, none of those have reached a state where they could be a code, and very few have the evidence to actually prove that extra soil or extra carbon rather is being sequestered on a permanent basis. So the desire is there, and I think it would be really useful for us to have as many different mechanisms for people to be claiming or be able to show that they are helping with the climate change debate. But until science catches up, it's very difficult to say this is true. What I think I'd really like to see is a land carbon code, or at least a land registry that says for the owners of a multitude of different types of land, that they could go onto that site and they could register their land, and they could then be told, okay, you're going to do woodland, here's the woodland carbon code. You're going to do peat, here's the peatland carbon code, and here's seagrass because you happen to have some, or salt marsh because you happen to have some estuarine habitat. And all of those being dealt with in the same sort of overarching code, but with their separate strands, providing the owner with I am able to sequester X tons of carbon. Who wants to buy?
Just on the back of that, Chris, you're absolutely right with the carbon side of things, but all I'd say is with biodiversity net gain and the DEFRA's new metric for measuring biodiversity units, it's very difficult, as you say, when it comes to bundling carbon sequestration together, that's great. And there's, as you say, peatland, seagrass, etc., etc. But it's trying to identify the additional benefits. And I know we've talked about this before in terms of the biodiversity benefits and that sort of thing that becomes difficult. So actually fairly accounting for everything can be quite tricky. And in terms of the traction for more payments for ecosystem services, it's the biodiversity net gain side of things is really going to be pushing the biodiversity side of things forward, hopefully. And then hopefully there are a lot of other sort of programs looking at different types of ecosystem services and trying to account for them and quantify them. So yes, Lloyd, there's a lot going on. Yeah. Watch this space.
Yeah, and I didn't say it was going to be easy, did I? It's just actually going to be complicated if you want to do all of those things. So don't expect it to be on the back of a fag packet, your calculation. It is going to have to be an in-depth analysis of what you've got on offer, because then we get, if you don't, then you get into the realms of double counting that Andy was saying before.
Yeah.
Okay, short question here, maybe a quick answer. Maybe you could answer this, Ilona. Can a coppice woodland be eligible for the Woodland Carbon Code?
I'm not actually sure. I think Andy probably is best placed to answer that question.
Okay, Andy, do you want to have a go at that?
It depends on how quick the coppice cycle is. In terms of a lot of the coppices that I've been involved in are 10, 15 years coppice cycles. It'd have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, but there's the potential for it. But bear in mind, you're probably going to be sequestering a very low amount of carbon. And that might not necessarily be the case. So I'd say yes, it depends on the rotation cycle, and it doesn't, you've mentioned wood products and that sort of thing, and no, the wood products are, as I say, it's only what's within the woodland. The harvested wood products at the minute aren't included. And just touching on that, because Caroline, you mentioned about it being a failing in the code, and I understand exactly where you're coming from in terms of not accounting for the embedded carbon. It's not quite the right word, but the carbon stored within the timber or the material substitution against steel or concrete. But there are other, it's very complicated to do that in terms of knowing in 40 years' time what the wood is going to be used for, and the amount of carbon emissions associated. So I do understand the frustration in the commercial sector as to that. But then looking at the potential in the future, personally, I could see a carbon tax on the materials used be a very clean way of doing it. And so essentially that would be timber prices would shoot up because the timber will be far more valuable because you're not having to pay nearly as much carbon tax as you would for steel or concrete. So it's kind of that you know, you're almost assigning credits at both sides. And I know that there are some construction companies and house builders, particularly in America, looking at assigning actual carbon credits at the end of the life cycle. And so that again is another way of potentially doing it with far more certainty than I'm planting a woodland now, what's the timber going to be used for in 50 years time? But I think that might be time, David. So sorry for rambling.
Okay, and John, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I did, because the other part of the strategy that we tend to forget about was the huge reliance government suggested on biofuels. And increasingly now we're hearing people wanting to explore that. I mean, a tree species that was new to me has come up in conversations recently, Paulownia. I've heard other things about, you know, eucalypts. You know, we're talking forestry, but there has also been a big ambition put forward on basically bioenergy, which, you know, coppicing in its way is. You know, we use it for timber products, but it also can be done for wood fuel. So, you know, we could find ourselves reluctantly possibly getting drawn into this debate as well.
Okay, thank you. We are coming towards the end of our time, so I need to see if I can skip through some of these questions. John Stride's asking, what does the panel feel is the key factor that could be extended, improved or increased to incentivise the significant UK government woodland creation targets of 50 to 70,000 hectares per year in future years? So a key factor. David McCulloch?
I mean, David, I was thinking about that purely from a private market perspective, and I mean, a rise in the price of carbon units would contribute significantly to the additionality case, and you know, derive huge demand for woodland creation from existing landowners. I'm sure Andy, Chris, John will offer another perspective as well.
Well, just on the back of that, David, no, that was my first thought exactly, is the price of carbon increasing certainly will increase interest in the market. But I think hugely importantly is improving the communication of the Woodland Carbon Code. And I know as project developers, a lot of project developers are finding that they're having to explain the carbon code from its inception all the way through to the point to companies who have no idea what it is. And so that's something on us really, is to market the carbon code far more clearly, and also make sure that we're upskilling the project developers that we're working with to make sure that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. And so I think that communication and that marketing of the carbon code can really help promote that, and then more investors is naturally going to mean higher prices.
Okay, here's one for you, John, and you know, this is an area that we possibly have neglected. He says, this is from Lloyd Jones. He said, I'm concerned about urban forests, that they've been forgotten about, where the majority, and that's where the majority of our population lives. Will there be any carbon-based grants in this space for trees and woodlands under half a hectare?
Can I thank you, David, for saving my fingers, because I started typing away furiously in the background to try and get an answer. I think to a large extent, we've got to say in the short term, we haven't been paying enough attention to trees in the towns and urban. In fact, that's been a criticism of the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group, that we focus too much on the woods and the forest without thinking about the trees and the towns, etc. But what I could say, I've seen lots of really great examples of where the urban environment, they've used iTree to put strong values on trees in the urban landscape. And that I know has been used very well to secure more funding and to set a way of increasing the canopy cover within the towns. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more positive response beyond that, but it is something I think as a climate change working group, we need to take away a bit more and remember trees aren't just in forests and woodlands.
Well, just on the back of that, John, it's, as you say, when it comes to street trees in particular, that becomes difficult. But Lloyd, when you're looking at 0.5 hectares, you can group up to 50 hectares of small schemes, which is any project under 5 hectares. You can group up to 50 hectares of those together and then go through the costs of the validation, verification and registration far more smoothly. And I mentioned there's a significant reduction in price and costs associated there. So the carbon code, as I say, does have no minimum area. There are economies of scale reasons where the bigger the better, just because it's cheaper in that sense. But this is where we talked before about universities and schools actually collaborating and getting local authorities together potentially, and actually trying to put all of that into one group can be far more efficient and far cheaper. So it makes that carbon accreditation simpler and fairer.
Okay, thanks. We have gone over time, but I'll ask one last question from Graham Clark. And he's saying, is the carbon code being developed so that it can measure additional carbon sequestered by the introduction of woodland management or changes in management of existing woodlands, or is that just simply too difficult? Can you try that one, Chris?
Yeah, I can. At the moment, it isn't being developed in that way, but that's not to say that it won't be. We are trying to get the Woodland Carbon Code as it is for new woodland to be kind of up to be taken up. There's not a great deal of science as well. Remember my points about science and evidence yet on the additional carbon that is sequestered from change of management. Although it is there, we probably need more of it before it can be brought into the Woodland Carbon Code. I think that's in the long-term sites. So again, it's one of those, watch this space. It will probably happen and there will be demand for it. But it's just one of those things that we just have to be sure before we actually move down that line that there's a product at the end.
Okay, we'll squeeze one last one in quickly. Sebastian Anstruther, we now understand that over half the carbon sequestered in woodlands is in the soil. Is this soil carbon part of the trading system, and what happens to the soil carbon at Clearfell? Can you give a short answer to that, Andy, please?
Yeah, it's a really important point, Sebastian. Yes, it is accounted for, and you have to, in your carbon calculator at the start, explain how you're preparing the ground, if you're non-intervention or minimum intervention scarification, or if you're heavy ploughing. Depending on the type of soil that you're doing that on, you have to essentially pay off that carbon debt before you can start generating carbon units. So yes, it absolutely is involved. And then there's a second part of the question, but your question has just been answered for me. But yes, I've lost you now. So yes, it is included.
Okay, so yeah, we'll conclude the questions there, but any questions that have been unanswered, what we'll do is we'll get back to the questioners directly with specific answers. So it just rests with me to say thank you for attending the Forestry Climate Change Working Group free workshop today. Everybody will be sent a copy of the recording shortly, and the group will update you on future events. If you do have any further questions or comments, please keep adding them to the Q&A function, and we will look to be able to respond to them if at all possible. So it just leaves it for me to say thank you very much for taking part, and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye. Thanks, guys.